more on what today's data is telling us about the U.S. economy, let's bring Daniel Hornung, former deputy director of the NEC and a current research fellow at MIT. Daniel, it's great to have you on, and let's start right there. What was your read-through for CPI, and specifically for core CPI, which did, on an annualized basis, come in a little hotter than expected and actually at the highest since February, but not necessarily spiking, or not necessarily spiking to the extent that I think some people have been expecting that we would see?
Well, it's good to be with you. You know, the market certainly took the report very well. I do think, as you know, when you look at that core CPI figure, one of the things that we are starting to see is after really 2 years of moving closer to that Fed target, we are seeing a little bit of an uptick in the sequential core inflation and underlying inflation data. And I think a large part of that is the moderate impact we're seeing of tariff pass-through that is likely to grow in the months ahead. You know, if you look particularly at import-sensitive categories, things like furniture, appliances, car parts, we're seeing a kind of shift in the inflation data there towards higher inflation. And when you couple that with the economic data that we've gotten over the last few weeks showing some labor market weakening, showing some slowing in economic activity and growth, I do think that despite the excitement today about the fact that the Fed will likely cut in September, there are some medium-term questions that really remain about the effect of tariffs both on the inflation side of the Fed's mandate and on the economic growth and employment side of their mandate.
Can you trust the data?
Look, I think you can certainly still trust the data. I do think that we are in an important moment, though, where it's going to be critical that members of the U.S. Senate really do interrogate this nominee and press him on whether he can commit to providing credible, nonpartisan data completely free from political interference. And if he can't, I think it's incumbent on them to vote no. And I think it's incumbent, too, on business leaders, on market participants, and others who really understand that U.S. economic data is the envy of the world because of how accurate and timely it is, to make their voices heard about the importance of this data being respected.
Well, people say what they need to say in a job interview, it seems to me. My question on these numbers is pressure in the economy, particularly on the working class, on the consumer. Thus far, employment has covered a multitude of sins when we've seen other pressure showing up in the macro data. But you mentioned tariff signals starting to show up. Consumers have kept spending thus far. At what point do we really get to see whether the consumer and the job market are going to be able to power through this?
I think you're going to see that tested in the immediate period, both because the impacts of tariffs we know disproportionately affect low and moderate income households. We also see in some of the data, like the Atlanta Fed data, for example, that after a period where wage growth was actually more robust at the bottom of the income distribution, we now see wage growth really slowing down at the bottom of the income distribution. We, over the last 6 months or so, have seen almost flat consumer spending in the aggregate. I suspect it's even weaker at the bottom of the distribution. So that's really an important measure to watch going forward. And I will add that, you know, the tax bill that was just passed has some aspects to it that will make things, I think, more difficult.
Yeah. What about healthcare costs, and even outside of that, well, maybe included, student loan payments coming due and having an impact on credit scores? At what point do we get to see the full impact of those things flowing through?
Well, I think one of the first things we'll start to see is on the healthcare front, as you mentioned, that folks who are getting their healthcare through Affordable Care Act exchanges will start to get notices this fall that their premiums will increase in some cases by 10, 15, 20% starting in 2026. That will be a significant, I think, burden on those households. And so that will be an issue to watch very closely. And as you note, the turning off of the student loan pause is already starting to show its way in some of the credit score data. So again, I think there really is a question here, not just about the macro performance, but about the distribution in the economy as well.
Right.
And we are seeing some challenges in the bottom half of the distribution that policymakers will need to be attuned to.